Good morning. Good to see each and every one of you here today. And we're going to start a new series of messages. We just finished the series on room for doubt. We just looked at things that people doubt about God, His existence and creation and all the implications that has for us. And it's been a good series, but I thought what I'd follow it up with is a series of messages on the struggles and the victories that we can have as being believers. You know, sometimes it's not so much believing in God as much as what you believe about Him. And so I want to look at some of the struggles we go through in our relationship with God and in His relationship with us. I've got a question. What do you struggle with? What do you struggle with in life? Sometimes we struggle with relationships. Sometimes we struggle with finances. Sometimes we struggle with, I need to put some weight on, I need to take some weight off. I mean, there's all kinds of things we struggle with. Is God one of those things that you're struggling with? Not His existence, but it's the kind of things that you're called to believe in about Him, and maybe the kind of things that He's calling you to do. Struggles that you have with your faith. I think a lot of the time, the struggling goes back to man's dilemma, all the way back to the Garden of Eden. It's the fact that man just didn't struggle very well with the concept of sin. Decided to go ahead and cave in on it. It's kind of like when God said, stay away from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, because if you cave into that one, you're going to know what I know, and you're going to know about good and evil, and it's not going to be good for you. The results would be bad. And so we kind of have the attitude of, there it sits. What do we do with this temptation? For you see, it's not just the Garden of Eden. It still affects all of us today. Something posed right there. If I do that thing, There's a great cartoon, Bugs Bunny. I love Bugs Bunny. And he's sitting there with a pie in his hand, and he's looking at this guy next to him. And you know what he's thinking. I'm going to throw this pie next to his face like that. And he goes, if I doed it, I did a whipping. I doed it. And boom, he throws the pie into the guy's face. I think that's man's dilemma. We do the same thing. If we doed it, it's not going to be good. But we doed it anyway. Romans chapter 1 kind of talks about that a little bit for us. We've read some of this Romans 1 passage in weeks past. But I just want to refer to a couple verses of Scripture. Verses 21 and 28. Paul writes these words, for although they knew God, meaning mankind, they neither glorified Him as God nor gave thanks to Him, but their thinking became futile and their foolish hearts were darkened. And then down to verse 28, furthermore, just as they did not think it worthwhile to retain the knowledge of God, so God gave them over to a depraved mind so that they would do things that they ought not to do. That's our dilemma. God just says, okay, if you're going to choose to do the things I don't want you to do, if you're going to choose to disobey me, then I'll give you over to sin and its consequences. But God did not give up on us. He gave us over, but He didn't give up on us. He had a plan for mankind. In other words, God came calling on man. And He would call out man to obey Him and to center His calling on a blessing for mankind. It's really what He wanted to do. He didn't want to just shove us away from Himself. He didn't want to condemn us. He says, I want to bless mankind. Even though they sin against me, even though I've given them over to the results of those sins, I still care for them. That's my creation, the greatest crown of my creation. And so He calls out to man and says, I have a plan that I want to work as we move forward. And I'd like for us to examine the calling of one man today. He really started with him. His name is Abraham. His story is found back in the book of Genesis. We look at something that God does with him and a calling in chapter 12. And I want to just read the first 9 verses of chapter 12. It says that the Lord had said to Abraham, go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land I will show you. I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. And I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse. And of the peoples of the earth, you will be blessed. They will be blessed through you. So Abraham went out as the Lord had told him, and Lot with him. Abraham was 75 years old when he set out from Haran. He took his wife Sarai, his nephew Lot, all the possessions they had accumulated, and the people they had acquired in Haran. And they set out for the land of Canaan, and they arrived there. Abraham traveled through the land as far as the site of the great tree of Moreh at Shechem. At that time, the Canaanites were in the land. The Lord appeared to Abram and said, "To your offspring I will give this land." So he built an altar there to the Lord who had appeared to him. From there he went on to the hills east of Bethel and pitched his tent with Bethel on the west and Ai on the east. There he built an altar to the Lord and called on the name of the Lord. Then Abram set out and continued toward Negev. Abram, or later on he'll be called Abraham, was known for his trust in God. But I would bet that he had his moments of struggle. It just wasn't automatic trust. It just wasn't automatic obedience. I think there were times, and I know we're going to demonstrate it in weeks to come, where he struggled with some of these things that God was asking him to do. He struggled with just obedience. And so the big idea of the message today is this: there is a struggle with God's calling on our lives. Everybody wants to talk about, oh yes, I've been called to be a Christian, and God has blessed my life so much. But they don't always talk about some of the struggles that they have. I hear about that a lot of times when I'm doing counseling sessions, just struggles that people are going through. And a lot of it is, I just can't seem to find God in this thing. Or maybe I do see God, and that's the problem. I don't know what to do in response to what he's asking me to do. God's calling, not to be a minister, I don't mean that kind of a calling at this point. Not that specific, but just his calling, just to follow him, just to obey him, is not easy. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, the German martyr, once wrote these words: "When Christ calls a man, he bids him come and die." You hear what he's saying? You die literally to some of the things of this world, some of the things that hold you close to the world. Death involves what you leave behind in order to follow him. And there's a struggle with that. It involves, first of all, the uncertainty of God's calling. I see that in the story of Abraham. The uncertainty of God's calling. When God says to him, "I want you to leave your country." Now that's a struggle. Because what he's really saying is, I want you to leave your family, which he didn't do. He took some of them with him, but that's another story we'll get into later on. But he said, I want you to leave your family. I want you to leave the friends that you have, the way of life that you're used to. I want you to leave all of that, and I want you to go to this land, and I will show it to you when you get there. Just move in this direction. Can you imagine the struggling that would go on in your mind at that point? You want me to what? Leave everything I know is familiar to my life. Everything is comfortable to me, and you want me to go someplace you don't even know, you're not even telling me where it is that I'm supposed to go. You want me to do that? There's a lot of uncertainty about that. You know what? I think I can relate to those feelings. When I left Cincinnati at the behest of the senior pastor at my church and my dad, didn't know they had a game plan, but I wasn't behaving myself very well, and they thought it might be good that I go to a Christian college for a year or two. And so my senior minister suggested to my dad, there's a little school out here in Illinois called Lincoln Christian College and Seminary, and that might be a good place for Tim to be. What they didn't tell me was, when they introduced this idea to me, we got to get the kid out of the city. That's another story too, but that's one that Abraham and Lot will deal with a little bit later on in this series. Got to get the kid out of the city. So I thought, okay, I mean, Jack says it's a good place, I'll go. So we travel 360 miles out to Lincoln, Illinois, and we unload everything. I get into the dormitory, and there's some guys playing some football. I thought, well, this is fun. So I went out and played some football with the guys. And that night when I came in, I could hear other guys getting settled in and stuff, and I'm sitting there in my room, and I'm looking out to the east. And as far as I can see, nothing but cornfields. And my thought was, what's a city boy doing in a place like this? Talk about uncertainty. I began to think about, what have I really done to myself? I don't know any of these people, not one of these people. And then I get some big red-headed guy with a lantern jaw walk in. Some of you know him, Lynn Ragsdale. Hi, I'm your roommate. And I thought, you look like a dork. I mean, I'm not thinking good things about this place because I'm kind of uncertain about what everything is going to be for me here at this place. Well, suffice to say, it turned out to be a really great blessing in my life. But I know those feelings of going somewhere and you're uncertain of what is going to happen to you there. It's not a good feeling. Not everyone is called to professional ministry, but you are called to change. Sometimes it's you change a job. Sometimes you have to change your habits. You might have to change your friends. Sometimes it's difficult, but family can be difficult for you. And God may say, you need to make some changes. And that's really tough to do. You know, Jesus spoke to this over in Luke chapter 9, verse number 62. Luke 9:62 says, Jesus replied, no one who puts a hand to the plow and looks back is fit for service in the kingdom of God. Now think of the imagery of that. Any farmer in those days who was out there plowing along, he's got a straight line ahead of him like that. Now, is he going to maintain a straight line if he has got a hold of the plow and he's looking behind him? You know nothing good happens from that. You got to keep your eyes focused straight ahead. And Jesus says, if you're going to follow after me, you're going to have to keep looking ahead. He said that after he had told his disciples a few things about following him that sounded tough. Like one guy said to him, I'll follow you, but let me go home and bury my dad. And Jesus' response was, well, let the dead bury the dead. Oh, man, he sounds cold and heartless, doesn't he? No, not if you understand the cultural context of that. Probably the man's father was not even dead. He was saying, let me go home until he dies. Probably he's not even sick. It was one more thing, if you read that whole context there, one more thing that people oftentimes put out in front before they follow Jesus Christ. And we've got to be willing to make those changes. To follow is to serve and requires setting Jesus as the top priority. The Apostle Paul would say in Philippians chapter 3, verse 13, just the second part of that verse, he said, what one thing I do, forgetting what is behind and straining toward what is ahead. This is the one thing I do. I forget what's behind. You know what Paul left behind himself? He left a lot of, I think, a great pedigree. Nobody knows exactly, but there's been people who've estimated that Paul had the equivalent of probably 2 or 3 doctorates. He was a brilliant man. He highly respected in the Jewish community. He became so zealous for the Jewish community that he was trying to crush the Christians as a heresy. And that's the guy who God called he would become the great Apostle Paul. But he says, you know, no matter what my credentials are, no matter what God is doing through me right now, I'm always forgetting what's behind because there's a lure that keeps pulling you back, and I strain for what is ahead to follow after God. Leaving your country, like Abraham did, means you leave some things behind, but you go to an unknown land. An unknown land. That's a struggle. There's something that gets our attention with the uncertainty of God's calling that has to do with going to that place which no one has ever gone to before. It's kind of like on Star Trek. You're there, boldly going where no man has ever gone before. That's what you feel like. There's a fear factor. And it's more than just a fear factor like you see on television where guys get into a casket with a bunch of snakes. You know, that I wouldn't do that. But there's people who do all kinds of crazy things that most folks are going to be afraid of. It doesn't have to be anything like that. Going to an unknown land just simply means doing something you're not comfortable with, something you're not sure about. Something like this. When I went to Lincoln, I had no idea I was going to become what I am today, a preacher. I was going there to try and get my head on straight for a year or two. But when this began to be a calling to God was saying, I want you to do something else, that really was a stretch. That's really unknown territory for me. To do what? To actually learn to preach? Man, you wouldn't get me in front of I was going to be a teacher, but you wouldn't get me in front of more than a classroom of about 15, 20 students. But to preach, public speaking was not my thing at all. But if God has a calling on your life, He provides a way for you to get past the fear factor, to boldly go where you're not comfortable in going. Why is that the case? Why does it always work that way? Paul had an answer for that one too in 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verse number 7. He says, we have this treasure jars to show that this is all surpassing power is from God and not from us. Because if you go on to the next verse, it says this, we walk by faith and not by sight. His all-surpassing power leads us forward, and it draws us. And we don't have to necessarily see all the things that are out in front of us. He is always saying, I've got this under control. When you're following me, you're going to have to sometimes realize you're not going to see exactly where you're going. You're not going to know exactly what you're going to do. You're walking by faith, not by sight. It's kind of like in the movie that many will watch again coming up this Christmas season, a little movie Polar Express. And the conductor makes the statement, it's opposite of what we oftentimes hear. We're always hearing, seeing is believing. But he looks at those kids and he tells them, believing is seeing. That's like saying you're walking by faith, not by sight. Believing is seeing. You believe, God will make the things you believe sight. Abraham had to leave his homeland. He had to believe God that all would be fine in this unknown land. Why could he put his trust in that God like that? Well, because he knew this, God promised to be with him. He promised to be with him. And he promises to love him and care for him. And there's something that's attached to that is really, really important. If you go over to 1 John chapter 4, take a look at verse 18. There is no fear in love, but perfect love drives out fear because fear has to do with punishment. The one who fears is not made perfect in love. Fear is driven away by God's perfect love. If he calls you to do something, there's a calling on your life, and it's, I want you to become one of my followers. That's the first calling. And then he's going to ask you to do other things. There's other callings that come after that. You can be afraid, but if you know this, he's with me. As a matter of fact, that's the last thing Jesus said to his disciples before he left this earth. I'm with you always, even until the end of the age. That means we're still in the church age right now. That's what he's talking about. He's with us. And when he's with us, his presence exudes his love for us. You feel that love surrounds you, and it drives out fear. So when God is calling you to do something, you don't have to be afraid. He's in it with you already. And he loves you enough to care for you all the way through. There is uncertainty in God's calling on your life, but there's the certainty of the one who calls you, and that's what you put more stock in. So, the uncertainty of God's calling, it's certainly there, but we have this going for us, as Abraham did, the promise of God's calling. When God calls you to do something, he promises to help you get it done. It's part of his plan. Remember that? I said God didn't condemn mankind. He had a plan that he began to move forward with, and Abraham was a kind of a flashpoint for that plan. Let's go back and look at it again in Genesis chapter 1. The plan there in verses 2 through 3. I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse. And all peoples of the earth will be blessed through you. That's the blessing, the promise. Somehow, what God is saying as part of his plan is this one man is going to become the beginning of a nation of people from all kinds of nations. God says, something big is going to come out of you, Abraham, but I need you to make some moves. I need you to follow the calling I have on your life. Abraham could believe the blessing part, but a great nation that comes out of him, what does that mean? He could believe his name would be great. God can do that kind of thing. He believed that there could be a blessing on his life. God would bless him directly. God would say, I have your back, and all the peoples of the world are going to recognize this. And all the peoples will be blessed through you, which would come to mean the through you part, an offspring. There's the problem for him. In the promise, there could be no offspring. How old was Abraham when he left this land of his to head out to where God told him to go? 75 years old. His wife, she's beyond childbearing years. They have no children. So the offspring part, Abraham could believe a lot of stuff about the blessing, but directly through an offspring, I don't have any offspring. That's the thing that would be the scary part here, the thing that you would struggle with. But he comes to believe this, that there's a faithful promise that God has given. Time would show God's promise to be true if Abraham believed and then followed. Great nation will come out of you, and your offspring, directly through your offspring, will bless all the world. Abram, your name means exalted father. But I will call you Abraham, which means father of many. How does this all work out? We'll drop over to the book of Romans. Romans chapter 4, verses 16 and 17. Paul has a lot to say in the first few chapters of Romans about this man named Abraham. But here in verse 16, verse 17, he says, "Therefore the promise comes by faith, so that it may be by grace and may be guaranteed to all Abraham's offspring." There's that offspring thing again. He's looking back at that. And you got to be looking forward with Abraham saying, where's my offspring? We can't have this because we don't have any ability to do this anymore. But he says, not only to those who are of the law, but also those who have the faith of Abraham. He is the father of us all. As it is written, I have made you a father of many nations. He is our father in the sight of God in whom he believed. The God who gives life to the dead and calls into being things that were not. Abraham would say, amen. Things that were not. I didn't have any children. God took care of that problem, as we're going to discover in the weeks to come. But he had to believe him first. The offspring would begin with his son Isaac. And it would go all through these generations down to a person whose name is Jesus. Now we begin to see the plan, what God is doing from this very much of a flashpoint with Abraham and his son Isaac. And it goes all the way down where God says, now, through it's my son, direct lineage of Abraham, but it's my son who will bless all nations of the world. His calling was just simply to believe. So he believed in this promise. And it was more than just a faithful promise. It was a gracious promise. God's plan in his promise would be salvation for all of mankind through grace. We cannot earn it. We can just accept it. And as God is always being patiently gracious with the world, with all of us. Go over to the book of 2 Peter chapter 3. Look at verse number 9. The Lord is not slow in keeping his promise, meaning coming back. He's never been slow on any of his promises, but sending Jesus back. The Lord is not slow in keeping his promise, as some understand slowness. Instead, he is patient with you, not wanting anyone to perish, but everyone to come to repentance. God's grace, his patience. He just wants this plan to work for as many people as possible. The promise of God's calling is salvation. And it's a game changer for all of us. Talking about how we struggle about things in faith. Stop and think about this. This God who is so patient with all of mankind, he's so patient with all of us that way. He's gracious. He's faithful. When you believe and accept your calling, life really begins. Now, you will struggle at times, not against who God is. You will struggle with what you believe about him, what you believe about your calling. But I'm telling you, you can trust the uncertainty of your future with this God because he keeps his promises. I remember years ago, a young lady with a couple of her kids would come to church every week. Her name was Ellen Snelly. Ellen was married to a real nice guy named Danny, but Danny would never come to church. But Danny wanted to play softball. And he thought he would play, because he knew some of the guys on our team, with our church, the old Southside Christian Church. We said, that's fine, Danny, but you realize if you're going to play on our team, you're going to have to come to church about 3 out of 4 Sundays. Now, those are the days when we had Sunday morning and Sunday night church. You got to come 3 out of 4 Sundays. Okay, I'm willing to do that. Danny, it was my privilege to baptize him months later. Danny would grow so fast in his faith that he was only a Christian for about 5 years. And his name was being turned in to be an elder. One of the other older elders said, "You think he's too young to be an elder?" I said, "I don't know if it has anything to do with age." Danny was in his 30s at the time. I don't think it has anything to do with age. It has everything to do with maturity. And Danny's more mature in his spiritual faith than a lot of people who are twice his age. Oh, I hadn't thought of it that way. Yeah. Danny grew. Danny accepted challenges, including the day that his job told him he had to move to Burlington. He didn't want to move. He didn't want to leave this land to go to an uncertain land. That's what I would call Iowa. An uncertain land in Burlington. But he followed his job, and he became hooked up with a church up there, was a good leader in that church, and then the railroad says, "Hey, we want to move you to Topeka, Kansas." So he left what was now a certain land for him to go to another uncertain land. Yes, you're in Kansas. It's not you're not in Kansas anymore. You are in Kansas now. And Danny became a great church leader out there and still is to this day because he was always willing to move on God's calling in his life, though he did not understand it always, and there were struggles, but he went. He would be embarrassed that I used him as an illustration today, but that's just part of Danny. I'm just simply saying this. If God calls you, there are going to be uncertainties, but you need to zero in on the promises that he will be faithful and he's always gracious. You will know what he wants you to do, but you got to walk by faith. And there's this idea, the obedience to God's calling. I've been all over that today, but let's just talk directly about it, the obedience to God's calling. What would have happened if Abraham had decided, nah, I don't want to leave the Ur of Chaldees here and head out to this place called Canaan, and I've never been there before? What if he just said that? Well, he didn't. Let's go back to Genesis. Let's look at chapter 12 one more time in just one verse of Scripture. Verse number 4. So Abraham went. Abraham went as the Lord had told him. And Lot was with him. Abraham was 75 years old when he set out from Haran. He went. Now, a lot of people try to say, look at that. God said, I want you to do this. And Abraham says, all right, I'm on it. I'm going to do it. I don't think it was quite like that. I think he struggled with some stuff. You know why? Because when I back up a couple of verses into chapter number 11, I come across this verse in verse number 31. It says, Terah, and that's Abraham's father, Terah took his son Abraham, his grandson Lot, son of Haran, and his daughter-in-law Sarai, the wife of his son Abram, and together they set out for the from the Ur of Chaldees to go to Canaan, here. But when they came to Haran, they settled there. They started out, but they stopped at a place where they thought, oh, we kind of like this place. God says, I want you in Canaan, but we kind of like this place, so we're going to settle down right here. Now, I know then when I began reading chapter 12, as I read for you earlier, verse number 1, it said, the Lord had said to Abram. That was past tense. It was not that the Lord spoke to him at the present tense. It's the Lord had already talked to him and his family about going on to this land of Canaan. Partial obedience. But as I go on and read in Genesis 12, verse number 7, it tells us there that the Lord appeared to Abram and said, to your offspring, there's this thing again, to your offspring. And Abraham's thinking, yeah, I know you keep talking about that, and I'm looking at myself in the mirror, and I'm looking at my wife. We can't do this thing. But what's God say to him? To your offspring, I will give you this land. And then in verse number 8, it says, from there, he went on toward the hills east of Bethel and pitched his tent with Bethel on the west and Ai on the east. There he built an altar to the Lord, and he called on the name of the Lord. Abraham was building altars to God. You can back up and read about it. Every place he went, staking out his claim on this land, and he was building altars to God, showing his obedience to him. Abraham was expressing a rewarding obedience. I want you to go with me to the book of Hebrews, to that famous 11th chapter. We call it the Hall of Faith. I want you to look at that with me very briefly, verses 8 through 12, because it's a summary of Abraham's life and legacy. By faith, Abraham, when called to go to a place he would later receive as his inheritance, obeyed and went, even though he did not know where he was going. By faith, he made his home in the promised land, like a stranger in a foreign country. He lived in tents, as did Isaac and Jacob, who were heirs with him of the same promise. For he was looking forward to the city with foundations, whose architect and builder is God. That's a great verse of Scripture. And by faith, when Sarah, who was past childbearing age, was unable to bear children because she considered him faithful who had made the promise. And so from this one man, and as good as dead, came descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and as countless as the sand on the seashore. Not necessarily biological descendants. He's talking about all of us because of Abraham's faith and becoming the initial part of God's plan of how he was going to save mankind through Jesus Christ, the lineage of Abraham, the Son of God, who died for the sins of the world so that we might all become part of God's family. Abraham's life and legacy. We are the great nation who continues to live the legacy of promise. And I'm going to tell you, you know it too. It's not easy. It's often a struggle. Often a struggle. But here's the point. God is still calling Abrahams just like you. Maybe he's calling you to vocational ministry. Maybe he's calling you to serve in a specific ministry in the church. And that will require then taking a good look at how you may have to change the use of your time, your talent, even your money. Maybe to change a job, or as I mentioned earlier, habits, even friends. That won't be easy. It's a struggle. To obey his calling and to follow him is not easy at all, but it's always worth it. Always worth the struggle. Just look around you today. I'm telling you, I'm looking out in the audience right now, and I know there's testimonies sitting all around you today of people who could say, yes, I've struggled with what God wanted me to do, but I'm always glad that I followed what he wanted me to do. Is God calling you? Then hear this conclusion. There is victory in God's calling on our lives, and I'll talk more about those victories in the weeks to come as we continue to talk about the struggles that we have with our faith. I read a great poem years ago written by George MacDonald, who lived mainly in the 1800s, and it's entitled Obedience. I said, let me walk in the fields. He said, no, walk in the town. I said, there are no flowers there. He said, no flowers but a crown. I said, but the skies are black and there's nothing but noise and din. And he wept as he sent me back. There is more, he said, there is sin. I said, but the air is thick and fogs are veiling the sun. He answered, yet souls are sick and souls in the dark undone. I said, I shall miss the light and friends will miss me, they say. He answered, choose today if I am to miss you or they. I pleaded for a time to be given. He said, is it hard to decide? It will not seem so hard in heaven to have followed the steps of your guide. I cast one look at the fields, then set my face to the town. He said, my child, do you yield? Will you leave the flowers for the crown? Then into his hand went mine, and into my heart came he, and I walked in the light divine, the path that I had feared to see. Great poem, great poem. I can just tell you, don't be afraid. There are going to be struggles. There are going to be issues you deal with. But God is in this thing with us, this thing called life, and he's in it when he calls you to do something special for him and for his kingdom. This time, I want to listen to a song that the worship team is going to sing. You maybe have heard it on the radio, but it gets into what we're starting today and what we'll carry forward in the weeks to come. The song is entitled, Fear is a Lie.